Welcome back, and you're still watching tonight. And of course, this would have been the time for News Gang, but you have made a decision to take a break today so that we can have this discussion about the budget 2023-2024 as read by the CS for National Treasury. And of course, my panelists are still here in studio, and I want to go through some of the data and the information that has come from today. And you're looking at the public data at the moment according to sources within the National Treasury and the Central Bank of Kenya. The estimate now is at about 9.6 trillion shillings. It was at about 3 trillion less in March 2022. Then if you look at the debt ceiling at the moment operating is 10 trillion shillings. So that's just about 0.4 trillion shillings shy of that ceiling, which is 400 billion shillings. The Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Professor Njuguna, Ndungu, is saying that the proposed debt anchor will be 55% of the GDP. We'll be getting to understand what that exactly means, because 55% of the GDP, at the moment the GDP, if you say it's about 13 trillion shillings, then that would get you to 7.15 trillion shillings, which is already way below the debt as of now, which is about 9.6 trillion shillings. Again, an estimate. Then, in accordance with the budget 2023-2024, we had sort of debt redemptions of about 850 billion shillings. The Cabinet Secretary was talking about external debt servicing that will have to happen at 475 billion shillings. And again, the Eurobond that is due for redemption, that is next year, June, of about 241 billion shillings. And he said there's some work they're doing to get someone to advise on some of the right decisions to take. Again, this is what I was telling you, that the revenue collection target for the next financial year is 2.57 trillion shillings, which is 17, according to the Budget and Appropriations Committee report, it is 17% higher than the current target of 2.1 trillion shillings. Of course, they say that revenue ordinarily grows by 10% across financial years, and the GDP growth has been revised downwards. And you'll get back to that, but first, going to the chairman of the Budget Committee, if you're introducing the debt anchor of 55%, if you had to base it on a GDP of 13 trillion shillings, or even, as you say, GDP of 16 trillion shillings, you still get to 8.8 trillion shillings as being the 55%. Yet, we are talking about 9.6 trillion shillings of debt. There's some more borrowing that is coming, so meaning we might actually get to the ceiling of 10 trillion shillings. What does this mean, and how do you move ahead?
First of all, the reason why we are moving from a static figure into a debt anchor, number one, is because economies are a moving target. Economies are dynamic, and it would be unfair for us to peg the debt ceiling in terms of a numerical figure, because every other year the economy changes. But to go direct to the question about why we are pegging it at 55%, one, in terms of the proposal that is on the table, we want our debt to GDP ratio to be around 55%. But you're also giving an oscillating band of around 5% upwards, or especially upwards. And currently, yes, I agree with you, we are past the 55%, but it's because we are setting also a benchmark for ourselves. We don't just want to talk, we want to walk the talk. And laws are not made for the current situation also. They are also made for posterity, and that is why we are putting a rather debt to GDP ratio that a bit lower, so that we also have a target that we are moving towards. But I also want to put it into context on the other discussion that we had around revenue, because this also affects revenue, and revenue also affects what we are discussing about in terms of debt. And I'm picking it up from where Abraham and Kanyi also left, in terms of whether we have set very ambitious revenue collection targets. And I want to say that, yes, we have set ambitious revenue collection targets, because we are also very optimistic as a government and as a regime, and we are basing it on three areas. Number one, when you look about especially ordinary revenue collection, number one, you look at tax administration. We are doing a lot in terms of tax administration in a way of trying as much as possible to make our revenue collection impersonal. You know, when there is a sitting between a tax collector and a taxpayer, then it's bound to be leakages. That is why we are investing resources in terms of automating our revenue collection. Number 2 is in terms of policy around tax collection. That is in terms of variation around our taxes, what we have done, which we anticipate will also add up to the basket. But also lastly, it is the physical side of the economy. What we are doing and we are targeting is not to continue overtaxing the people who are already paying taxes. What we are seeking to do, and I hope you'll get time to check on the revenue side of the budget, is that we have been able to allocate resources in areas that we deem will have the highest impact to our economy, and especially by allocating monies through value chains. Some of these areas that we propose that will be able to expand our tax bracket is that we have been able to put money in terms of production. And allow me 1 minute to emphasize on this.
Okay.
How we look at it in terms of the economy. Economy of Kenya, we can measure it in three areas. One, we can aggregate household incomes, and we arrive to some figure around GDP. But also number 2, and the one we are laying a lot of emphasis on, is GDP, where you aggregate primary production, plus secondary production, and also plus tertiary production. And we are putting a lot of emphasis on that. Number 1, in terms of primary production, and I'm still answering the question about revenue. We have put in money around farming, because primary production basically is everything primary. That is agriculture, fisheries, mining, forestry, and everything else around there, which basically accounts for around currently 18.2% of our GDP. We are putting money into agriculture. That is why we have put in 5 billion towards fertilizer. And I heard my sister Wanjiru maybe saying we could have added more, but there are reasons. Number 1, the monies that we appropriated through the supplementary budget in terms of fertilizer, because we changed the way we expend our subsidy, that money is still available. Number 2, the global fertilizer prices have come down, and we were able to measure that during the just concluded KTDA fertilizer, which they are purchasing. That is number 1 in terms of agriculture. Number 2 also in terms of policy around forestry. In many countries, forestry also accounts for a lot of wealth and also income to the country. We are lifting the moratorium because we need to harvest the trees that we should be harvesting. In terms of mining, last year, we did what we call geophysical survey in terms of identifying the mineral resources in our country. We have allocated 500 million Kenya shillings now, going into a rather previously moribund department. Mining has been forgotten. We have put in a lot of resources for ground truthing so that we enhance GDP on that side. Okay. 2, in terms of industry, we have put in money in terms of aggregation centers across all the 47 counties. Excordation of grants, 4.7 billion Kenya shillings. We have put in money for 6 EPZs, newly gazetted, 6 spread across the country. There is one in Busia, there is one in Nakuru, there is one in around the border between Murang'a and Kiambu, one in Kirinyaga, one in Coast. We are doing a lot around that area because we want to net as many people as possible getting jobs. And lastly, so that I complete that point, the other one, tertiary, accounts for around 65% of our GDP. But there is a mismatch. And if you check even on your news every time, you report when it is the companies are having the close of the year. We are in the recent past, we are reporting double-digit growth in terms of profitability, in terms of service industry companies. When we look at banking, unprecedented profitability. But then we have to ask ourselves, this service industry that accounts for 65% of our GDP, what is this servicing? Services should make the economy efficient. But if you look at the primary production, plus the secondary production, they account for only 35% of our GDP. Yet, especially the primary production, it accounts for 70% of employment in our rural area and 40% across the country. That is why we have to work around the two to increase, number 1, productivity, even as we increase production, and then net as many people to become agents of production and thereby enlarge the tax bracket.
You've packed a lot in that answer, which we'll be trying to unpack with panelists here. But let me take you back to the question of public debt. So you're saying the target is 55%. And like I told you the calculation, because you're telling me that the GDP of the country now is no longer 13 trillion shillings. It's actually 16 trillion shillings. And when you calculate, you find that, sorry?
Well, I'm still concerned because
yes.
I think I would like to know what is the basis of this 16 trillion, because the statistics we have from the Central Bank of Kenya indicate that it's 13.3 trillion. We just checked that, the nominal GDP. So I don't know what is the basis, whether it's a projection we are now basing our GDP on a new projection, which we haven't seen in the documents. I think that would be interesting. But allow me to also ask a question to Muhesh.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, when he talks about agriculture, and this government has talked a lot about agriculture, when we look at the records of the committee that he's in charge of, Budget and Appropriations Committee, the target is 225,000 farmers. The total farming population is 5.5 million. So the fertilizer subsidy is basically targeting 4% of the farmers. Tell me how you spur growth by targeting 4% of the production from the primary perspective.
Okay.
Two, there's also a lot of emphasis on importation. I know there are taxes that have been increased, but there's still a lot of emphasis on importation of the same products that we produce here. I sense a mismatch on that. Just a rejoinder, thanks.
Okay, so I think those are three questions coming out of that. But first, on that question, what is the GDP of Kenya, and what are you basing it at to say that it's 16 trillion?
I want to refer, we went to the same school with Dr. Abraham. There is a difference between 2021 ending and 2023. We are currently talking about the budget for financial year 2023-2024. And in fact, if we had checked the record right, the last year's budget, which we are exiting, actually based our GDP at Kenya shillings 14 trillion. And therefore, the current figures that we are basing our GDP at is actually 16 trillion, and it's not usually a prerogative of those in power to calculate GDP. If there is time, I would have given you that formula on which we calculate GDP on, so that maybe we can assist each other.
So how do you reconcile what the projection is versus what the Central Bank or the National Treasury has published?
It is a matter of timing. We are now in the year 2023 mid, and you are talking about financial year, which you haven't started yet. What Dr. Rugo is referring to is up to last year. And therefore, the discrepancy is a matter of time. It's not a matter of who is right or wrong.
Right. Could I just chime in?
But if you could,
because beyond, could I just chime in? Because beyond, could I just chime in? Because beyond the numbers, this argument is sounding eerily similar to the same conversation we had with the previous figures that were put forward by Treasury, where the GDP, where the calculation of the GDP figures was outstripping what we felt was the reality on the ground. Now, what it means when government chooses to work with a higher GDP figure than what might be supported by the situation on the ground, it means that you're massaging figures and you're making your debt look a lot more manageable, giving you more fiscal space to borrow more. But the question we have to ask, GDP is about job creation, it's about the businesses, it's about the revenue they generate because the economy is turning around. It's not about borrowing. And so we have had, under Call Chumi, one of the issues we brought up is how do we measure GDP? Because are we really measuring the factors that are going to put money in the pockets of Kenyans and put food on the tables of Kenyans? Or are we playing around with figures that make our documents look all right and we are looking at our international ranking and rating so that we can borrow more? So this is sounding like a conversation we've had too many times before, and I'm seriously getting concerned.
Okay. What is the GDP according to you?
For me, actually, it doesn't matter.
No, you should.
I'm not. Let me explain. I am not an economist, so I've left the economist to explain it from an economic perspective. For me, I'm a tax expert. For me, and then I would argue just like an ordinary Kenyan. So whether it's increasing, I don't know GDP, what am I able to afford basic needs? Am I able to take my kids to school? Am I able to go to hospital and get quality health care? So I think we shouldn't get lost into percentage of that and GDP is what, to what is the ordinary Mwananchi actually going through, and can they feel this number that we are talking about?
And Mheshimiwa, let me just give you an opportunity to clarify this, because if it is 16 trillion shillings, like you say, the debt the 55% debt anchor would be 8.8 trillion shillings. Correct. We are now at 9.6. Very soon we might hit the 10 trillion shilling. So what happens, because already you're planning to borrow 718 billion shillings, what happens when we hit the 10 trillion shilling ceiling, despite the new anchor that might be endorsed by Parliament soon?
Sam, I told you earlier that what you are doing, basically, even as we have made this law, because when we set the debt anchor, we are actually amending the law. We are also doing the same by setting a base and a benchmark for ourselves. Because we understand we are not just changing the law because of the current situation. We are changing the law also in terms of where we desire to be. Okay. I agree with you, yes, that if actually we base it at 16 trillion as it is now, the current debt is actually 62.5%. But as I said, and I keep saying, we are doing it consciously. Number two, what we have currently and debating is a draft. And a draft also communicates the aspirations. Okay. There will be a debate going on through Parliament, and I'm sure we'll come up with the right figure. But allow me also, because...
There's that question on...
yes. Agriculture.
Subsidy fertilizer targeting 225,000 farmers against farmers who are 5 million.
Yes, yes, very good. You know, sometimes we confuse what is happening within the economy with the budget. Many times we read the budget and we seem to see the economy through the lenses of the budget. Unfortunately, as the panel, all of them, they know, if I'm to use the other formula of GDP, which is actually more simplistic, how do we calculate it, even as we arrive to the figure that we are arriving at? We do it through GDP as a measure or as a measure of private consumption, that's number one, plus private investment, plus G, which is government, and G is actually the budget, plus X minus M, which is export minus import. Let me repeat for clarity. GDP is Royal Media Services is a private company. Other private citizens out there, they are private consumption. Then you add that to the private investment. Then you add G, which is everything government, consumption and investment. Then plus X minus M. And then that lays the basis of the policies that we all make. G accounts for only 22% of the entire infrastructure. So to say that we have allocated this money targeting this number of farmers, then you need to look at it in terms of context. What else have we done on the other value chains? Take for example, cotton farmers. What have we done to them? It is in the budget. You add that on the summation. What are we doing in terms of policy, in terms of spurring this bird of 18.2%? And knows very well, when we are talking about agriculture in terms of budget, we don't necessarily mean agriculture in terms of what we know as agriculture. We mean primary production. Agriculture in terms of budgeting incorporates forestry, incorporates mining, incorporates fisheries, and every other thing primary. When you go to the side of policy, there is something we are doing around fishing. When you come to the point of forestry, there is something we are doing around lifting the moratorium in terms of harvesting our forestry resources. So it is a broad area.
So the 5 million farmers,
yes.
What do they grow?
No, question. Question, because a question is, if we are looking at a bottom-up budget that prioritizes agriculture to transform our economic, the economy really, yet the budgetary quantum, the ceiling going to agriculture has not changed.
Does it reduce?
Right? The budget we have this year and the budgets we had under the Jubilee administration in terms of energy, construction, the sector ceilings haven't changed. Health is another transformative sector. Also, the ceiling hasn't changed. You know, how are we to believe that this government is really bringing something new and not doing what we've seen before, which is tokenism? Because remember this, even the Jubilee administration had a fund that they gave to the informal sector, some little money that they put there to kind of assuage the tensions and ease their conscience and say we are doing something.
Right.
Because our problem is the accountability deficit with our governments. We've seen this over the years, whereby projects are put into the budget for the express purpose of stealing, budgeted corruption. Call it state capture, call it what you will. And this happens in energy, construction, the infrastructure budget. This is why you will find we can overestimate what the revenue will be, so that when we decide to borrow, we then massage the GDP figure, and I'm painting a scenario here, but at the end of the day, we have not put that extra money. This growing GDP is not growing our social sector. It's not growing our high impact sectors, because where you put money is where there is growth. So I appreciate the lessons in how to count the GDP, but vitu kwa ground, viko different. The reality is jobs. The reality is put money in those sectors, and then you will have a growth. And during the COVID period, when we had a reprieve in terms of the taxation, we saw the impacts. When we had subsidies that were going out to support critical sectors, we saw the impacts. So the argument actually being made by a lot of experts, including the Parliamentary Budget Office, saying this taxation is actually the goose that lays the gold, it's killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And so we are finding that for all the talk about transformation, this budget and the arguments are sounding so similar to the previous administration. It is concerning.
Okay, Honorable Wanjiru, please note them down, because there are many issues that are coming your side. I hope we have sufficient time for you to respond, but also for the others to express themselves in concerning the budget 2023-2024. I want us to take a short break, but there is so much to deal with, including the taxation policies that are being proposed, the taxation that now is the name changed to housing tax, what that means, and of course the benefits accruing, and what more will happen in the coming days, months, and whether the willingness and the strength of character that Honorable Wanjiru talks about here is sufficient to make sure that there's no corruption in the country. After the break.